and hop into it. Both players are at 10-2. Bob Huang is on Goryo's Vengeance, Brian Huffman, who is on Jund. And let's go ahead and see what happens.
So for any of you who are unfamiliar with these decks, we haven't seen Jund yet. And basically, Jund is kind of the classic mid-range control deck of the format. It's looking to get some card advantage, control the board, and then win with a couple efficient creatures. Bob's deck, on the other hand, is a really, really, really unique deck. Basically, he's looking to use Goryo's Vengeance or Through the Breach to get a Griselbrand in play, and he can do that extremely early. He has some discard outlets, he has some ways to get some extra mana on specific turns, and as soon as he gets Griselbrand into play, he'll be able to start drawing cards, and with the shoals, he can replenish his life total, and eventually he'll be able to get a Borborygmos Enraged in play, and then just kill his opponent on one turn. So I believe that this deck is capable from some extremely early wins. I mean, I think there may even be a Goldfish that's like a turn 1 or 2 win, which is pretty broken.
Wow. So Brian Huffman here is going to start off on an Inquisition. He's going to take the Goryo's Vengeance out of Bob's hand, but it looks like Bob was able to pick up Faithless Looting, and that's going to get things going for him. He could very easily just draw into some pretty busted cards here and win the game very early.
Yeah, this Goryo's Vengeance deck is really, really hard for the Jund deck to play against. Jund is set up as being a very interactive deck. It has discard spells, it has removal spells, but the problem is it's just not set up to interact with the Goryo's Vengeance deck. The discard against Goryo's Vengeance can be a little dicey. The targeted cards like Thoughtseize and Inquisition have their use, but one of Jund's best discard sources is Liliana the Veil, and it can be really scared to activate that with its plus ability because you may be enabling Bob to put a Griselbrand into play and then Goryo's Vengeance it out.
So it looks like Bob is going to go ahead and get rid of a Borborygmos Enraged and a Desperate Ritual to that Faithless Looting, and then pass the turn back to Brian. He's going to take a draw, and let's see what he has going on here. I have to imagine that he needs to put a threat on the battlefield, something like Dark Confidant, maybe even a Tarmogoyf, or even a Scavenging Ooze might be pretty good.
Yeah, he definitely wants a Tarmogoyf. If he gets a Scavenging Ooze, the Scavenging Ooze would be a little bit of a slow target. The fact that it can start exiling things from Bob's graveyard is very valuable. But he really wants to make sure that he doesn't die as much as he can, but he really needs to get some pressure also.
So it looks like Brian did have another discard spell with a second copy of Inquisition of Kozilek, and that's going to take the second Goryo's Vengeance out of Bob's hand, who just has 3 lands and an Izzet Charm that's left over.
So one thing that I'm particularly excited about with this matchup is Bob Huang is an extremely good deck designer. He was the one who originally kind of broke Treasure Cruise when it first came out with the blue-red Delver deck in Legacy, and I know that this Goryo's Vengeance deck is a deck he's picked up, and he's one of the innovators of it and has led to its increased popularity. So this is going to be really exciting to see how he plays it.
So it looks like we just get a Verdant Catacombs here from Brian Huffman. He's going to fetch on Bob's end step, put an Overgrown Tomb onto the battlefield, and Bob just played a land and passed the turn. I have to imagine he's looking at using an Izzet Charm on Brian's end step to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. He did pick up a copy of Griselbrand, which is very good, but 2 of his Goryo's Vengeance are already gone.
Yeah, things are lining up pretty well so far for the Jund deck. The Jund deck has had the right kind of disruption. I mean, the Jund deck normally only plays about 6 removal spells in its whole, 6 targeted discard spells in its whole deck. And so far,
we're seeing half of those now.
Yeah, Brian's drawn half of them. So that's really, really good for Brian. Despite that, he still needs to, develop some pressure. So far so good for Brian, but he's still missing that one piece of the puzzle for his draw, which is pressure.
Yeah, he still needs a threat to actually end the game. Now, looks like Bob is thinking here in response to the Thoughtseize, maybe using the Izzet Charm to either counter or to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, but I think he's just going to let that resolve. So Brian is going to take the Izzet Charm, leaving Bob with a Bloodstained Mire Mountain and a Griselbrand. So Brian Huffman has done a real good job at picking apart Bob's hand, and now here's the payoff, as he does have a Tarmogoyf that's going to come down as a 4/5 and will end the game in 5 short turns if Bob doesn't do anything.
So the one thing that can be a little scary is that Bob's deck is capable of some pretty powerful sequences. I mean, he's going to be able to flash back his Faithless Looting and get that Griselbrand in the graveyard if he wants. And he could just top deck a Goryo's Vengeance. Or if he just plays, a few more lands, he can just top deck a Through the Breach and also put the Griselbrand into play that way.
So it looks like Bob is just going to flash back his Faithless Loading. He did draw into 2 additional lands and a land for his draw step. So his hand was just a bunch of lands and a Gristlebrand. He decided to get rid of 2 of his lands. Brian's just going to go ahead and attack with his Tarmogoyf for the turn. Looks like he has 2 lands and a Kolaghan's Command in his hand. So I have to imagine at some point he's going to try and use that to either get in some damage with Bob or snipe a card out of his hand and rebuy something if he needs to. And there is that Through the Breach that you were talking about, Andrew. So Bob has Through the Breach, Gristlebrand, and a land in his hand, so he is going to be able to try and get something going. Now, it's important here to note that Brian does have only 2 mana available here. Had he kept 3 lands available, he could have actually got this. He could have potentially tried to use something with his Kolaghan's Command, with taking a card out of Bob Huang's hand here on this turn. But I mean, you'd have to be some kind of clairvoyant to know that this is the correct time to use it.
Yeah, the other thing too is from the previous discard spells, Brian knows that Bob has a lot of lands in hand, and if he casts the Kolaghan's Command, it's a good chance that Bob would just discard one of those lands and it wouldn't actually have that big of an impact. But this is exactly why this Goryo's Vengeance is so good and why Jund has such a hard time with it. Is the Jund deck basically had the perfect draw of just 3 discard spells and 2 Tarmogoyfs, but Bob's, probably just going to win the game from here.
Yeah, so he's just going to attack with his Gristlebrand. He's going to put Brian Huffman down to 8. He's going to go up to 17. He's going to go ahead and draw 7 cards here. And at this point, what he's looking for is Nourishing Shoal and Worldspine Worm to gain a whole bunch of life so that he can activate this Gristlebrand a bunch more. So looks like there is a Worldspine Worm there. It also looks like there is a Nourishing Shoal. So at this point, he just needs to cobble together a bunch more cards so that he can put a Borborygmos Enraged on the battlefield and just throw some lands at Brian Huffman.
Yeah, I mean, some of the interaction, this deck uses a lot of cards that are not particularly common. Essentially what Nourishing Shoal does is he's going to be able to discard this Worldspine Worm instead of paying the mana cost for the Nourishing Shoal, and he's just going to be able to gain a ton of life and be able to draw 7 with the Gristlebrand and continue doing this until he's basically seen almost all the cards in his deck.
And at that point, he's going to be able to use his Elvish Spirit Guides and Desperate Rituals to try and power out either another Through the Breach or something of that nature to put a Borborygmos onto the battlefield. At this point, he does have a Borborygmos in his graveyard, so all he needs to find is a Manamorphose, a couple Spirit Guides, and one of those last Goryo's Vengeance, and he can just kill his opponent.
Yeah, I mean, Bob is just a real master of this. He's not going to make any mistakes, and this is basically game, but it certainly highlights how difficult this deck can be to fight against. I mean, sometimes this Goryo's Vengeance deck, it trips over itself, but you can have a lot of disruption, but if he just pairs a Goryo's Vengeance or a Through the Breach at any time with a Gristlebrand, I mean, it's just off to the races.
It's pretty crazy, just how good pay 7, draw 7 really is.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of people try to abuse Gristlebrand in various ways. I mean, we see it a lot in Legacy, for sure. But even in Modern, people have tried to develop different kinds of strategies to abuse Goryo's Vengeance's, abuse Gristlebrand's power of just drawing 7 and losing 7 life. And I think this deck is the one that's done it the best so far.
So one of the things you see here is as Bob is going through drawing all these cards, he's kind of organizing them into a couple different piles so that he knows, what plans he needs to do at what stages, so that he can go ahead and just end the game whenever he needs to end the game.
Yeah, I mean, he's literally drawn all the cards in his deck, and now he's just dumping out a few Spirit Guides to make some red mana.
Oh, and we got the F6.
Seems like we have a Moto Grinder on the table. And yeah, so he's got enough red mana out of nowhere to Through the Breach, a Borborygmos, and then he can just discard lands to finish Brian off.
So it looks like we've got a storm count of about 15 at this point.
Yeah, and at this point they're just having fun. But this deck is a deck that's not, you don't really see it too much. I mean, there's really not that many people who play this Goryo's Vengeance deck. It's very difficult to pilot, but it's extremely powerful as we've seen it there. And that combo, you can see it done extremely early. The fact that there's Simian Spirit Guides and Desperate Rituals means that Bob can actually get a lot of mana really early on, even as early as turn 1 or 2.
Yeah.
And this is definitely a card that is on a lot of people's radar, probably for this upcoming Pro Tour.
So let's go ahead and take a look at the sideboards here for Bob and Brian and see what kind of action we're going to have going on. So Bob has 3 Pact of Negation, 1 Beseiju who shelters all, 1 Rending Volley, 2 Pyroclasm, 2 Sudden Shock, 2 copies of Painful Truths, 2 Shatterstorm, and 2 Inquisition of Kozilek. What do you think Bob's going to bring in here?
So this is going to be a tricky deck to evaluate. I don't believe that Bob is going to want to sideboard a whole lot. I think that you can make an argument for the Pact of Negation if he just wants to protect himself a little bit. If he doesn't think his life total is going to be under duress that quickly and it's going to be more about fighting through the Jund disruption, he may want to bring in a card like Painful Truths. And I think you can make a small argument to Inquisition of Kozilek. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Bob, almost just shuffles up the same deck because it's just naturally so good against Jund.
I definitely agree with that. I think that Painful Truths might be something that he wants to bring in as a way to battle all that discard. But then again, we saw there, didn't even need it.
Yeah.
3 in a row. All right, you're dead on turn 5.
Yeah.
As far as Brian Huffman's concerned on Jund, we've got 1 additional Thoughtseize, an Unravel the Aether, a Pyroclasm, an Ancient Grudge, 2 Kitchen Finks, 4 copies of Fulminator Mage, a Painful Truce, a Shatterstorm, an Obstinate Baloth, a Knight of Souls Betrayal, and a Hunt Master of the Fells. Does he really have anything here for this?
Well, he's certainly going to bring in the 3rd Thoughtseize, and I think also he'll bring in the Fulminator Mages. The Fulminator Mages are not particularly great, but any kind of interaction that he can have to disrupt his opponent is pretty important. Also, Brian just has all of these dead removal spells. Cards like Maelstrom Pulse, cards like Abrupt Decay, Terminate, they really don't do a whole lot. He might be able to sneak in a Terminate in response to the activation of Grizzlebrand and have that be effective. But a lot of the times, I don't think that's going to actually let him win the game. That may just let him play for a turn or 2 more. So I think Brian is going to be reaching for cards, and he just wants to get those bad removal spells out. When I play Jund, I even brought in cards like Hunt Master of the Fells just so I have more of a clock, because I have so many dead cards.
Yeah, as we saw there, Brian just really needed some type of early pressure to go along with all that discard, and he just wasn't really able to cobble it together. So while we wait for our players to finish sideboarding and shuffle up, let's just go ahead and take a quick look at these awesome invitational tokens that you can get simply for playing in our opens or buying orders on StarCityGames.com. So we have Alex Bastecki, who is our Season 3 Invitational winner in New Jersey, who is a 0/0 germ, and I really like this token.
Yeah, Alex Bastecki has a bit of a science background, so for his token he wanted to be a bit of a mad scientist. I really like how all the players, they bring in some of their own personality into these tokens. I think it's a lot of fun.
Also has a pretty sweet beard.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm jealous. I won't lie.
I mean, I'm not, but so you can receive a limited edition invitational token for all of our open participants, all of our classic participants, and in all orders from StarCityGames.com. Now, we also had an invitational after that where Caleb Shearer won, and he is a Storm counter. So Caleb won that invitational with his Abzan aggro deck in Standard and Affinity deck in Modern, but he is known as Legacy Mad Scientist, primarily with the Storm deck, so he decided to go with the Storm counter.
Yeah, I mean, quite the Storm fanatic in Legacy. He's known for playing it, basically forever. Another thing that's particularly exciting about Caleb is, I mean, he was kind of a nobody a year and a half ago. And then he just sort of broke onto the Magic scene. He decided that he wanted to do really well on the Star City circuit. He really wanted to get into the Players' Championship. And, he's just really come out of nowhere and kind of been a little bit of like a dark horse story for a lot of the narratives going on, and it's been exciting to see him rise.
Perfect. And again, that's going to start January 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for orders on StarCityGames.com, and you can get those in person starting in Atlanta for the Standard Open, which is the Oath of the Gatewatch release. So we've got Brian Huffman on Jund is 10-2. Bob Huang on Glorious Vengeance is also 10-2, and it looks like both players are taking mulligans.
Yeah. Either way, it's going to be tough for Jund. I wouldn't even say that the mulligans necessarily favor the Jund deck more than the combo deck, although normally I feel like combo decks really want to have more cards as opposed to a deck like Jund that has so many individually powerful cards on its own.
Yeah, I think that even when mulliganing, plus it's offset by the scry, Bob, while he does have to cobble together some number of cards to win the game, he has a lot of redundancy, and everything is just so powerful that once something gets together, it's just over. Uh-oh, it looks like Bob picked up 7 cards.
Yeah, well, while the judges resolve this, I remember the last time that I played a Grand Prix with Jund and I faced this Goryo's Vengeance deck. It's one of the first weekend where this deck kind of had a big showing. And it was pretty interesting for me because I remember I played a player in one of the early rounds playing Goryo's Vengeance, and the player was a little new to the deck, didn't know all the interactions, and the deck really didn't seem that well to me. And then later on in the tournament, I was, I don't know, maybe X3 or X4 on day 2, and I played against one of Bob's friends playing the Goryo's Vengeance deck, and it was unreal. He was just splicing onto Arcane, all these different cards. I just couldn't pick him apart no matter how many discard spells that I drew, and then he just Blood Mooned me out in game 3, which I didn't see coming. It doesn't seem like Bob has Blood Moon in his deck yet, for this week, but playing against a really good player playing this deck, it's like night and day from someone who's inexperienced.
So it looks like here Brian is going to be actually mulliganing down to 5. Bob, it looks like, since he didn't actually pick up those cards and look at them and put them in his hand, they just went ahead and put the 7th card back on top of his library, and he does have his hand of 6, which he is currently keeping. So we're hoping here that Brian can have a playable 5, get some nice cards, or a nice card off of his scry, so we can actually get on here and have a match. But it is not looking good for Jund. 1 mulligan's bad, 2 mulligans is worse, and he's even playing a bad matchup.
Yeah, I would expect the Jund player, even if they have a fine 7-card hand, to mulligan it anyway, just because the matchup is so bad. You have so few cards that are actually good in the matchup, and I would have expected Brian to, mulligan fairly aggressively to try to get just some sort of turn 1 discard spell into a turn 2 Tarmogoyf for Dark Confidant. That's really how he wants to start.
So we see Bob here is going to fetch out an island with his Polluted Delta, and it looks like he's going to cast a Serum Visions, which is a new addition to this deck. As traditionally it was just straight black-red, but it looks like that 3rd color has been added for Serum Visions, and also gives him a super-powered Painful Truce out of the sideboard. Yeah,
we also saw the Is It Charm last game also, which is kind of a nice way to draw some cards, discard some cards.
So it looks like Brian's just going to draw for his turn, not have a second land, and pass the turn back, which is not boding very well for him.
Yeah, and it's pretty. This tournament has been pretty exciting because I've definitely heard a lot of people sometimes complain that Modern is kind of a stale format, but we've been seeing things get shaken up quite a lot. I mean, the big mana decks like the Amulet Bloom deck have been sort of the new kid on the block that's really been dominating, but we've also seen the Blackout Drazi decks start to do really well. Bob and some other people have been slowly tuning this Goryo's Vengeance deck, and I think if the only thing you look at is the top 8s, you don't go down the list to see who's in the top 32, top 64, things can look a little stale, but I feel like right under the surface there's quite a few decks that are really close to being one of the major contenders in the metagame.
I definitely agree. I feel like Modern is just a huge format, and we can even see that here from the metagame breakdown that we talked about a little bit earlier. There are literally 15 to 20 decks that are in this day 2, and there's only 67 participants.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. That is exactly what you want. That's a nice, healthy metagame where there are a couple top decks, so you have some sense of what you're going to expect, but then there's just such a larger diversity. It's almost like a pyramid structure. And so that's certainly what I look for in a game.
So it looks like after a couple Serum Visions and making his land drops here from Bob, Brian unfortunately has missed his land number 2 and land number 3. And we're going to his next turn. Looks like it's not a land. And unfortunately, it's not looking very good for Brian. Bob's on 3 lands. Looks like he has a bunch of action in his hand. And we're just a few turns away from Bob doing his thing and taking this game.
Yeah, not only is it a bad matchup, but it looks like Brian's draw is just not lining up well for him. And currently Bob just has all the time in the world. He has no reason to rush. He can just sort of bide his time, sculpt his hand, and he can just kind of combo out at his convenience.
So it looks like Brian does have a 1-mana discard spell that he was able to pick up, an Inquisition of Kozilek. So he's going to use his Wooded Foothills, take that Overgrown Tomb out of his deck, and Inquisition Bob. Now, Bob does have an Is It Charm in his hand, so he might just counter this to protect something that's in his hand, depending on what else he has. But again, a lot of these combo pieces, Through the Breach, the creatures, and the like, costs more than 3 mana. So Inquisition is mainly looking to get some of the enablers, the mana enablers, something like Goryo's Vengeance, or maybe even Nourishing Shoal, depending on what else is in the hand.
Yeah, that's one of the tricky things about this deck is that a lot of the things that you would want to make them discard are just too big.
So it looks like here we've got a Goryo's was taken off of the Inquisition, but I have to imagine that Bob's going to use his Izzet Charm here to try and draw into some more lands with the idea of just trying to, through the breach, a Worldspine Worm onto the battlefield, which can attack for 15 and then put 3 5/5s.
Yeah, so if you're unfamiliar with Worldspine Worm, essentially when it dies, you get a bunch of tokens, and the tokens are about as big as it is. So that's a good 2-turn clock.
So it looks like he did fire off that Izzet Charm. He was able to pick up 1 land and another copy of Nourishing Shoal. I imagine he's probably going to get rid of one of the Nourishing Shoals. Oh, yeah. Or maybe he's going to get rid of the land?
Don't need it. Don't need it. I got more on top of my deck.
Yeah, they're going to be there. Don't worry.
Whatever Bob does, I'm just going to assume it's the right decision. I mean,
yeah, I'm just going to default. Bob knows best.
Yeah, I have a lot of faith in Bob.
So it looks like he's going to get rid of that land, which is a little interesting to me since it seems like his line of play here is just to, through the breach, a Worldspine Worm.
I do agree with that also. I think he may just assume that he's going to be able to draw more lands. He might have drawn some already off that Izzet Charm. And his deck has a lot of mana in it. I mean, he's got,
like the Spirit Guides, Desperate Rituals, and he did draw a Spirit Guide. Oh, he can Splice for 4 mana.
And these are the interactions that I was talking about. The first time I played against this deck, my opponent didn't really know how to splice things properly. And then I played against one of Bob's friends, and it seemed like he had all of this card advantage from this splice mechanic that I had never seen anyone use.
So what he did there is Bob got rid of the land so he could keep 2 Nourishing Shoals and a Worldspine Worm along with the through the breach, so that he was able to Nourishing Shoal, pitching Nourishing Shoal, splicing through the breach onto the Nourishing Shoal for only 4 mana, which is what he needed the Spirit Guide for, to put the Worldspine Worm onto the battlefield, attack for 15, and then make 3 5/5s.
Yeah, quite the impressive play. And that really just shows, Bob's making use of card mechanics that we have not seen in an extremely long time, and we've basically we haven't seen them printed in a long time, and we haven't seen them used in an even longer time. I mean, the whole splice mechanic, I think, is something that some people have kind of forgotten about.
Yeah, it's not a very, I don't want to say it's not a very intuitive mechanic, but it can be tricky sometimes as far as with how it actually works, like what happens when it gets countered, this and that, what happens when there's multiple targets and one of them's not legal. Like can be some tricky things with it.